Hello, bruvs. We're back with Radical Spirits, Spiritualism, and Women's Rights in 19th-Century America by Braude.
It's in the air, it's in the world. Our love dreams are singing louder. Spring has come, love has begun. All of the floors and hearts are free. Spring, spring, spring begins the life of love. Spring, spring, spring awakes the hearts of men. The snows have passed, the winter's gone. Beautiful flowers go to pick for my love. Spring is here, flowers are revealing their fragrant signs of life. Begins the life of love. Spring, spring, spring awakes the heart. Birds chirp their song, I sing along, hearing the sweet air profoundly with sound. Notes ring afar, reaching my love, filling her heart with sound. Spring, begins the life of love.
Hello, bruvs.
Awakes the hearts of men.
Hello, bruvs. We're back with Radical Spirits, Spiritualism, and Women's Rights in 19th-Century America by Braude. Not to be confused with Broads. Chapter 3, Thine for Agitation. The emphatic individualism that placed spiritualism in opposition to established religion had social and political implications as well. Pardon. Dependent for spiritual knowledge on the unhindered autonomy of female mediums, believers vigorously applied the principle of individualism to the role of women. As a result, they became ardent advocates of women's rights. Equal rights is my motto, declared the medium Elizabeth Kingsbury in 1857. But she found that woman has been so long subject to customs degrading to herself that neither she nor the men are sensible where and to what extent they, equal rights, exist. When spiritualists applied their drastic changes to allow women to express their true natures as human beings, they found that the norms imposed by society dictated both an immoral theology and an immoral structure of relations between human beings. In response, they argued that women needed to be freed from limited education that restricted the development of their intellects, from unjust laws that denied them access to their property and custody of their children, from unequal marriages that subjugated them to men, and from economic restrictions that forced them into dependence. Spiritualists' commitment to the emancipation of women formed one plank of a broad reform platform designed to overthrow convention imposed by church or state between the individual and his or her God-given nature. They denounced the authority of churches over believers, of governments over citizens, of doctors over patients, of masters over slaves, and most of all, of men over women. Spiritualists' radical vision for the reformation of society paralleled the extreme individualism of the religious practice. Their faith was antithetical to institutional religion because it asserted that truth came directly to the individual without meditation by minister, Bible, or church. The ability of spirits to reveal the fate of the human soul directly to human beings at the time and place of the spirit's choosing obviated the need for scripture, sacrament, or sanctuary, even for worship. Unlike church attendance, which reinforced the worshiper's identity as a member of a congregation, attending a seance was an intensely individual action. Investigators consulted mediums in hope of personal communications from intimate family members, mother to child, brother to sister, teacher to pupil, by providing a form of religious practice in which truth revealed itself to individuals without recourse to external authority. Spiritualism became a magnet for social and political radicals throughout the 19th century. Spiritualists adopted much of their social program from individualist rhetoric already articulated within the left wing of the movement for the abolition of slavery. However, as a group, they differed from other abolitionists by lifting women's rights out of the reform platform as preeminent. The new religion injected its followers' priorities into the radical agenda as it came to permeate several groups central to the progressive audience of the period. Members of the New England Non-Resistance Society, the Christian Socialist Hopedale Community, and the schismatic Quaker Friends of Human Progress adopted the new faith because it offered a religious outlook that incorporated their individualist principles. Many radical abolitionist leaders also became adherents. In addition, the large audiences assembled by spiritualists at their own conventions became crucial to the dissemination of radical ideas. At these events, women's events, women's rights was not presented as just another reform. What's up, Mr. Hockey? Rather, spiritualists believed, as one advocate put it, that woman's freedom is the world's redemption. As investigation of the manifestation swept the nation, spiritualism became a major, if not the major, vehicle for the spread of women's rights ideas in mid-century America. Are you Gordie Howe's ghost? Spiritualists at Seneca Falls. The same summer that the Fox sisters arrived in Rochester, the historic Seneca Falls Convention met to consider the social, civil, and religious rights of women. dissident Quakers in upstate New York provided the nucleus for investigation of the two equally controversial innovations, spiritualism and women's rights. Woman's right. I don't know why she insists on using woman's rights instead of women's rights. In June 1848, Lucretia Mott, a Quaker preacher from Philadelphia, participated in the organization of the Congregational Friends in Waterloo, New York, and then remained in the region to visit her sister. Martha Coffin Wright. It was then that Mott was reunited with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whom she had met at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840, and the two sent out the call for the first women's rights convention, the American woman's, I'm going to get it right one of these times, the American Women's Rights movement drew its first breaths in an atmosphere alive with rumors of angels. Members of the Waterloo Friends flocked to nearby Seneca Falls and figured prominently in the convention's proceedings. Raps reportedly rocked the same table where Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton penned the Declaration of Sentiments, which formed the convention's agenda. The table stood in the parlor of progressive Quakers and future spiritualists Thomas and Mary Ann McClintock. Raps were reported at Stanton's home as well. From this time on, spiritualism and women's rights intertwined repeatedly as both became mass movements that challenged the existing norms of American life. The two movements shared many leaders and activists. While not all feminists were spiritualists, all spiritualists advocated women's rights. Andrew Jackson Davis allied himself in marriage with an adamant women's rights activist from Western New York, Mary Fenn Love, who joined Stanton and Anthony, as well as a half dozen Rochester spiritualists, in calling the first New York State Women's Rights Convention in 1853. According to the Spiritualist Press, Mary Love had consecrated her life, her all for the redemption of her sex. After her marriage in 1855, Mary Fenn Davis quickly outstripped her husband as a public spokesperson in both movements. In point, a pleasing oratory, observers found her even more acceptable than her husband. Spiritualism has inaugurated the era of woman, Mary Davis proclaimed. She recalled the common birthplace of the new religion and women's rights in 1848. Since the time, spiritualism has promoted the cause of woman more than any other movement, Davis explained. Speakers and mediums participated in the general women's rights agitation and promoted women's rights from their own platforms. Announcing the 1851 Women's Rights Convention, the Spirit Messenger and Harmonial Guide called its topic the most important reform issue of the day. Spiritualist conventions called for the emancipation of women from all legal and social disabilities. Incipient spiritualists among the Progressive Friends asserted the rights of women with a boldness that shocked even Elizabeth Stanton and Lucretia Mott. When the Seneca Falls Convention adjourned, its participants agreed to reconvene in Rochester 2 weeks later. Appointing ex-Hicksites Amy Post, Sarah Hallowell, and Sarah Fish, and the ex-Presbyterian Sarah Owen, a committee on arrangements. When this group made the unprecedented proposal that a woman preside over the convention, Mott and Stanton stoutly opposed it as a most hazardous experiment and urged the election of Lucretia's husband, James. The convention threatened to break up, but after convincing reassurances from Amy Post and Rhoda DeGarmo about the ability of women to preside at conventions, Abigail Bush was elected and took the chair. Consistently, those who assumed the most radical positions on women's rights became spiritualists. Nancy Hewitt has analyzed the group of Rochester ultraist, not altruist, women who led local campaigns for women's rights, abolition, and spiritualism. She found that they came from Hicksite farming villages in western New York, where they had imbibed the tradition of isolation from the world, but activism within their own communities. In Rochester, Hewitt located the ultraist reformers on the lower rungs of the new urban bourgeois. Amy Post, Rhoda DeGarmo, Marianne and Thomas McClintock, Sarah D. Fish, Catherine Ann Fish Stebbins, Sarah Hallowell, Sarah Anthony Burtis, cousin of Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Coleman, and Eliab Capron were among progressive friends who participated in the Seneca Falls Convention and the follow-up convention at Rochester. All became spiritualists. Three of this group, Amy Post, her sister Sarah Hallowell, and Sarah Fish, made the historical recommendation that the Rochester Women's Rights Convention elect a female president. Abigail Bush, who filled the office, described herself as born and baptized in the old Scotch Presbyterian Church, whose sacred teachings were, if a woman would know anything, let her ask her husband at home. The only non-Quaker among the original group that witnessed the Fox sisters' manifestations at the Post's home, Bush became a lifelong spiritualist. Spiritualism and women's rights spread simultaneously through the network of Quaker abolitionists that produced the first supporters for both movements. Susan B. Anthony, daughter of a Rochester Quaker family and member of the Waterloo Friends, missed the Seneca Falls Convention but had become Elizabeth Cady Stanton's partner in leading the agitation for women's rights by the early 1850s. She recorded in her diary that spiritualism, as usual, was the principal topic when she dined with a group of Quaker abolitionists and women's rights pioneers at the Philadelphia home of Lucretia Mott in 1854. She noted each reformer's opinion of the topic in her diary. Pioneer abolitionist and feminist Sarah Grimke, an ardent believer, was all enthusiasm in the faith. The Jew turned atheist Ernestine Rose and a Mrs. Curtis, believing the spirit inseparable from the body, expressed their disbelief. Anthony reported that Elab Capron, the early promoter of the Fox sisters, doesn't believe. He knows there is a reality in spirit disembodied, communicating with the living. But Anthony herself did not take in the debate. The rest of the company, she wrote, with myself, seemed not to know whether or not there is any truth in these modern manifestations. The uncommitted group included her hosts, James and Lucretia Mott, whose extensive investigations never convinced them of the reality of spirit communications. Similar scenes occurred among black reformers in Boston, where Charlotte Fortin struggled with the avid faith of William Cooper Nell. The early women's rights movement, like spiritualism, drew both inspiration and leadership from the left wing of the movement for the abolition of slavery. Radical abolitionists, in turn, found in spiritualism a religion in harmony with their individualist principles. Abolitionists' interest in both women's rights and spiritualism derived from their fierce loyalty to the principle of individualism. They opposed slavery because it depended on the unique or the unjust usurpation of the individual autonomy of one person by another, and they found the same injustice in the relations between men and women in the dogmatic teachings of the churches. Although slavery was the issue whose urgency awakened abolitionists to the need for action. The individualist basis of their agitation sensitized them to an array of injustices, which, at times, included the appropriation of Indian lands, capital punishment, the abuse of alcohol, and legal enforcement of the Christian Sabbath. To name a few examples, a sisterhood of reforms composed of peace, temperance, and health reform, as well as anti-slavery, came to occupy many who entered public life through abolition. The issue of women's public participation split the abolition movement. The evangelically inclined conservative group argued that assigning public roles to women was so controversial that it would detract from the achievement of freedom for the slave. The more radical followers of William Lloyd Garrison believed that they were fighting for freedom as an idea and that denying it to women would not hasten its approach for slaves. Once the two groups split in 1840, Garrisonians were free to mix both women's rights and religious radicalism with anti-slavery agitation. The Garrisonian American Anti-Slavery Society put the leading women's rights speakers on its payroll during the 1850s, although it required them to allot a portion of their lectures to abolition. For most Garrisonians, women's rights became a part of the sisterhood of reforms, and for many, spiritualism did also. Spiritualist reformers found adherence to prescribed gender roles inconsistent with the principles or the principle of individual sovereignty. Let every woman who feels the chains imposed on her, pardon, I'm pouring some water, by tyrant custom, resolve to break them, cost her what it may, declared Miss S. Hill, writing on individualism in The Agitator, a spiritualist periodical. She enjoined women to disregard customs that limited their freedom to follow their own consciences. How can we be our own sovereigns as long as we allow others to think, feel, and act for us and are content to be ourselves, the mere appendages of those who presume to prescribe for us our appropriate spheres? Hill asserted, and many spiritualists concurred, that men also compromised their individuality by conforming to accepted gender roles. Let man, too, the slave of passion, of prejudice, and of ignorance, become his own sovereign, she proposed. Society's notion of appropriate behavior for men and women should not be allowed to preempt the divine order expressed in human nature. Spiritualist rhetoric gave the reform of gender roles the same urgency that others saw in winning freedom for the slave. Spiritualism and radical individualism. The individualist ferment within abolition produced a moral critique of the churches that underscored the theological dissent discussed in the last chapter. Radical abolitionists agreed with romantics and transcendentalists that the church, the clergy, and the Bible were so many enslavers of the human spirit. They also believed that individualists' principles required constant agitation in order to effect the transformation of society. While the more moderate majority of reformers based their programs on Christian teachings, radicals urged men and women of conscience to come out from the churches. They viewed the churches as corrupt because their failure to take a stand against the ungodly institutions of slavery proved them untrue to Christian principles. The Garrisonians' critique of the church stemmed from Christian perfectionism, the doctrine that it is possible to obtain complete freedom from sin in this life. Perfectionism contrasted with the orthodox view that we are bound to sin as long as we are bound to our bodies. Abolitionists, come-outers, discovered their churches to be tainted by the sin of slaveholding and fled in search of more pristine alternatives. Most radical reformers were intensely religious. Their rejection of the churches was a rejection not of religion, but rather of the corruption of religion. The abolitionist and women's rights advocate Lucy Coleman recalled that when she became a spiritualist, she gave up the church more because of its complicity with slavery than from a full understanding of the foolishness of its creed. Like other reformers, her anti-slavery led her out of the church, but the Garrisonian program provided no alternative spiritual outlet. It asked abolitionists to take a religious stand against the churches, the clergy, and the Bible, but it offered nothing in place of these cherished institutions. The religious anarchism of spiritualism provided a positive religious expression that harmonized with the extreme individualism of radical reform. While the Garrisonian critique began with the church's acceptance of slavery, it did not end there. The fullest elaboration of the radical critique of established religion found expression in the New England Non-Resistance Society, founded by abolitionists whose moral encounter with slavery led them to condemn any institution based on the use of force. They took their name from their extreme pacifist position, which condemned the use of force even in self-defense. Non-resistance followed the logic of these ideas to condemn the authority of any human being over any other human being because it usurped the authority of God by interfering with the autonomy of a moral agent. They believe that individuals should look within themselves and act according to the convictions placed there by the Creator. Non-resistance found immoral attempts at coercion in virtually everything associated with Protestant religious practice, in the hierarchies of denominations, in the exercise of discipline over church members, in the power of the clergy, and in the use of the Bible as the test of truth, not trash, pardon. They call sovereignty to describe the state of absolute individual autonomy they believe to be God's intention for every person. Consistent application of the principle of self-sovereignty that emerged from the struggle against slavery required a complete transformation of the existing power relations between men and women. Non-resistance and self-sovereignty, especially when their feminist implications were spelled out, proved to be controversial and divisive ideas, even within the ranks of abolition. When the short-lived New England Non-Resistance Society declined in the late 1840s, the anti-authoritarianism of spiritualism attracted the movement's leaders. Henry C. Wright, the voluntary unhired agent of the New England Non-Resistance Society, who helped plan the Grimke sisters' famous speaking tour in 1838, became one of spiritualism's earliest and most energetic converts. When Wright adopted views on individual moral autonomy, extreme, even radical abolitionists, his political position found full support in spiritualist religious practice. Assuming the role of self-appointed, unpaid agent for spiritualism, as well as non-resistance, he supported spiritualism publicly as early as 1850 and received convincing communications at Leah Fox Fish's seance table the following year. He was ubiquitous on the spiritualist platform, frequently using it to criticize gender roles until his death 20 years later. According to the American Booksellers Guide, Wright was second in popularity only to Andrew Jackson Davis, among spiritualist readers. Spiritualism reached deep into the ranks of radical reform when it penetrated the Christian socialist community of Hopedale near Milford, Massachusetts. The most long-lived of the antebellum socialist communes, Hopedale was known as a stronghold of non-resistance. Henry C. Wright made his headquarters there, where reformers attempted to emulate the communal life of the first Christians. Spiritualists remembered Hopedale as a sound theoretical and practical women's rights association. Resident Abby Price, an early women's rights activist, was ever present to provide eloquent rebuffs in the if the community failed its principles. Spirit manifestations appeared at Hopedale early in 1851, following reports of the rappings from Henry Wright, and in Hopedale's newspaper, The Practical Christian. Hopedale's founder and leader, Adin Ballou, longtime president of the Non-Resistance Society and former Universalist minister, found the manifestations convincing and adopted the new faith. A few months later, Ballou's 19-year-old son, Aidan Augustus, died suddenly of typhus. The community sank into grief, consoled only by the hope of spirit communication. Their hopes were realized when the spirits of Aidan Augustus Ballou moved the hands of two young residents known as writing mediums. Seance circles multiplied at Hopedale. The prominence of spiritualism at Hopedale tied the new religion more closely to the network of radical reform. Ballou served as president at two of the earliest spiritual conventions, at which other Hopedale residents also served as officers. Two Hopedale residents, Brian J. Butts and Harriet N. Green, produced a newspaper entitled The Radical Spiritualists, which advocated spiritualism, socialism, anti-slavery, non-resistance, women's rights, anti-oath-taking and office-holding, temperance, vegetarianism, anti-tobacco, tea and coffee, and every other reform which requires the practice of a higher life. The co-editors were married, but Harriet Green retained her own name because she had no intention of delivering up soul and body to the keeping of any man, however worthy that man might be. Hopedale's favorite medium, Fanny Davis, advocated both women's rights and non-resistance, even when speaking in trance. For a depiction of Fanny Davis's mediumship many years later, see Plate 6. All right, we'll do that later. Other socialist communities, some exceeding Hopedale in their assault on gender roles, also showed a propensity for spiritualism. Manifestations appeared in 1853 at the Radical North American Phalanx in New Jersey, from which Abner French went on to become a leading spiritualist. They also appeared at Josiah Warren's Modern Times community and at the Wisconsin Phalanx, where leader Warren Chase, a forceful and Midwestern advocate of spiritualism, adhered to both non-resistance and women's rights. Women's, not women's, for whatever reason. In addition to members of the New England Non-Resistance Society and residents of socialist colonies, disaffected members of the Society of Friends constituted an important element of those who adopted spiritualism as a faith in harmony with radical politics, both feminist and abolitionist. Quakerism furnishes a good substratum for steady and permanent progress in reform, observed Alfred and Anne Denton Cridge, who found that spiritualist and reform lectures attracted 4 or 5 times as many people in the Quaker city of Richmond, Indiana, as in their larger hometown of Dayton, Ohio. Quakers adopted spiritualism with relative ease because of its similarities with their own practices and ideas. Many of the Quakers who adopted spiritualism, like Amy and Isaac Post, had already withdrawn from the Society of Friends in search of greater freedom of conscience on political issues. Although the Hicksite separation attempted to resolve the relative positions of Quaker discipline and spiritual freedom, the debate continued to divide local meetings throughout the antebellum period. Small groups withdrew in search of greater freedom of expression, like the Waterloo Congregational Friends in upstate New York. They were often spurred by anti-slavery sentiments. By 1850, about 16 groups had formed in New York City, or in New York, Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, and Michigan, variously called Congregational Friends, Progressive Friends, or Friends of Human Progress. The Pennsylvania Progressive Friends withdrew to form a separate meeting in 1852, which met annually until 1905. According to Albert J. Wall, historian of the movement, they all claim to be throwing off the authority and formalism of superior church bodies to return to the liberty and simplicity of primitive Quakerism. The Friends of Human Progress fill the gap created when come-outers left the meetings that had previously nurtured their faith. Progressive Friends came together to replace the sense of community formerly provided by Quaker fellowship, but their phobia of infringements on individual religious freedom meant that their reason for association lacked religious content. Like other come-outers, disaffected Quakers found in spiritualism a positive religious expression of their commitment to freedom of conscience. Across the Midwest and New York State, Quaker splinter groups investigated spiritualism and discussed it at yearly meetings and quarterly conventions. Quakers sought in spiritualism an intensity of religious experience that their own tradition had trained them to expect, but no longer satisfied. Sarah Thayer, a former Hicksite, never enjoyed a Quaker meeting with such pure zest as she did in 1857's Spiritualist Convention in Rochester. She rejoiced that there was much good speaking and considered it a blessing that she was able to hear the spiritualist lecturer Charlotte Beebe, also an ex-Quaker, or is that Beebe? I think it might be Beebe. The leader of the spiritualist community in Troy, New York, wrote that his own and another ex-Quaker family preferred spiritualism to Quakerism because the Quakers feed their followers on husks, and they are indeed very dry. These friends drew their expectations for religious experience from Quakerism, but satisfied them with spiritualism. The cultivated anti-authoritarianism of the Friends of Human Progress provided fertile soil for spiritualist belief, as well as an open platform for its promulgation. Spiritualism was the ruling element at the 1856 Michigan Yearly Meeting, where Henry C. Wright played a prominent role. The following year, the same group resolved that modern spiritualism had promoted human progress physically and spiritually. Susan B. Anthony, clerk of the Waterloo Friends of Human Progress, they changed their name from Congregational Friends in 1854, reported the more advanced and rational class of teachings of the harmonial or spiritual views and ideas were commended as worthy of acceptance. In Richmond, Indiana, a circle of mediums formed on the platform at the 1857 meeting of the Friends of Progress, and a clairvoyant answered questions and described diseases. Spiritualism occupied a day and a half of the 4-day meeting of the Progressive Friends of Pennsylvania in 1859. Thomas Wentworth Higginson spoke in support, presenting an outline of the argument which satisfied his own mind that the so-called spirit manifestations are genuine. Finally, the meeting adopted a testimony that condemned opposition to investigation and expressed gratitude for the power spiritualism is exerting to break up sectarianism, enlighten individual minds, and elevate the lives of many. Andrew Jackson Davis presented the harmonial philosophy to progressive friends in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and New York. By the late 1850s, most Quaker splinter groups accepted spiritualism. Mediums emerged from the leading women in the progressive friends. Charlotte Beebe worked as a medium in Massachusetts in 1855 and soon became a popular spiritualist lecturer. She wrote her lectures in trance and delivered them in a conscious state. In 1857, she served as secretary of the Michigan Yearly Meeting of the Friends of Human Progress and addressed the meeting on the unity and diversity of all things in the universe, especially of religions and of all movements for the amelioration of the condition of the race. Mary Thomas Clark, a minister of the Congregational Friends of Indiana, spoke at spiritualist conventions throughout the 1860s. Mediums also participated in the Indiana Yearly Meeting and the Friends of Human Progress meeting in Cattaraugus County, New York. As with both women's rights and abolition, the attraction between the Friends of Human Progress and the Spiritualists was mutual. Meetings were advertised in the Banner of Light and other spiritualist papers as well as in abolition newspapers. Spiritualists and progressive Quakers endorsed an identical reform platform. By the 1860s, the intermingling of the two movements was so extensive that it was difficult to tell them apart. A spiritualist convention held at Rockford, Illinois in 1857 proposed sharing the name as we do the goals of the Progressive Friends of Pennsylvania. After this, spiritualist groups calling themselves Friends of Progress dotted the Midwest. But it is difficult to determine how many originated with dissident friends. In Decatur, Wisconsin, the 1862 meeting of the Friends of Progress featured the trance speakers Miss M.J. Woodbury. The medium Mrs. Cutts was the main speaker when the Friends of Progress met in Layton, Michigan in the same year. The Quaker historian Allen C. Thomas found no record of meetings of progressive friends after 1865 and attributed their demise to the abolition of slavery, which he believed put an end to their reason for being. However, several groups did not disband, evolving instead into spiritualist meetings. The most explicitly spiritualist of all the Quaker groups, the North Collins, New York Friends of Human Progress, continued meeting throughout the 1860s and 1870s. They arranged their 14th annual meeting so that those wishing to attend both this and the annual spiritualist meeting in Buffalo can do so in one trip. In 1869, when mediums were under attack, they passed a resolution in their support. In 1883, they incorporated in order to rebuild their meeting place, Hemlock Hall, which was ultimately replaced by Lily Dale, a spiritualist summer meeting ground that still flourishes today. In Indiana, the same radical Quakers who led the Friends of Human Progress during the late 1850s and early 1860s subsequently participated in a series of meetings whose name slowly transmuted from denoting Quaker roots to asserting spiritualist identity. Progressive Friends Agnes Cook, Valentine Nicholson, Mary Thomas Clark, and James Cooper attended the yearly meeting of Progressive Friends and Spiritualists in 1862. the quarterly meeting of the Progressive Spiritualist in 1863, and the quarterly meeting of the Friends of Spiritual Progress in 1864. By 1865, the words Friends and Progress were gone, but Cook and Cooper served as officers at the 3 days meetings of spiritualists at Greensboro, which apparently replaced the other groups. In 1866, Michigan hosted the first state convention of spiritualists and Friends of Progress. In New England, disaffected Quakers of radical political views never formed separate meetings, but some became spiritualists without group support. The Buffum family in Rhode Island and the Robinson family in Vermont, for example, each welcomed spiritualism. Both families were active in the women's rights movement and used their homes to house fugitive slaves traveling on the Underground Railroad to freedom in Canada. Let me see how far I've come here. 55 to 68, that's 13 pages. About halfway through. I'll stop at some point here. Roland and Rachel Robinson had withdrawn from the Society of Friends because of its indifference to abolition several years before the Rochester rappings. Anne King of the Robinson household described her alienation from her Quaker meeting. I always stood in everything with the liberal part of society until, in search of still greater freedom, I found myself outside of the pale of sectarianism altogether and could not bind myself again, yet should like to attend meetings with the progressives. Were I near enough, she wrote to Amy Post. Anne King's commitment to individual spiritual autonomy took her outside the pale of all organizations, yet she still longed for the fellowship of association. Quaker splinter groups used their new freedom to explore both radical religion and radical politics. While emanating from the Society of Friends, they were motivated by the same anarchist leanings that prompted other reformers to blend religious and political concerns. Feminist editor Mrs. H.F.M. Brown found the 1857 meeting of the Geneva, Ohio Friends of Progress to be the most progressive, most radical meeting we have ever attended. Splinter groups discussed the host of issues on the reform agenda. In addition to the equality of the sexes, spiritualism, and abolition, the 1855 Ohio yearly meeting of Friends, or of Progressive Friends, for example, considered the abolition of capital punishment, the overthrow of intemperance, writing and spelling reform, the use of tobacco, and land monopoly. And the person wrote, wow! They found their 3-day conference inadequate for the full examination of their many concerns. Other meetings addressed health reform, marriage reform, and the exploitation of labor by capital, as well as condemning sectarianism, the authority of the Bible, and the setting aside of the Sabbath. The 1857 Michigan Yearly Meeting of Progressive Friends claimed that its resolutions embodied the highest ideas of the Friends on nearly all the subdivisions of progress. During their 4-day meeting, speakers included Sojourner Truth, Martin, a fugitive slave, Charles Burleigh, and Parker Pillsbury on freedom without distinction of color, Friend Peace of Cincinnati on freedom of the public lands, and Charles K. Whipple on the principle of freedom of religious opinions. On Sunday, Mary Fenn Davis spoke on freedom without distinction of sex to an audience so large that it could be accommodated under no roof in the place. The Friends of Human Progress joined in the condemnation of the churches as agents of oppression in general and as oppressors of women and slaves in particular. proceedings of the 1857 meeting of the Geneva, Ohio Friends of Progress resolved that making merchandise of men is a legitimate outgrowth of Bible religion. Therefore, all attempts to eradicate slavery from our land while we continue to nurture and nurse the parent stem, must of necessity prove a failure. A speaker then made a very strong speech in which he argued that women were in an enslaved and crushed condition, and that the old theology was responsible for it because the Bible and the church taught that man was far superior to woman. According to the Waterloo Friends, any attempt to base reform on the established churches was, in the first place, a piece of arrogance, intensely narrow and Romish. Is that Romish or Romish? And in the next, a wild hallucination and an utter futility. These conventions made explicit the bonds between religious and political reform. The Spiritualist network, including Progressive Friends, assembled large audiences for promoters of radical causes. These meetings allowed for the dissemination of women's rights ideas beyond the occasional convention devoted to them exclusively. Speakers more skilled in agitation than organization welcomed the opportunity to address receptive groups. A large convention in Providence, Rhode Island found that all departments of human improvement and practical reform come legitimately within the scope of a broad spiritualism. Because the present selfish and antagonistic relations of society are unsuited to a higher spiritual condition. This justification was frequently offered for the introduction of social and political reforms at spiritualist conventions. The Providence meeting then adopted resolutions addressing a variety of specific reforms because spiritual growth and welfare depends on one's physical health and surroundings. Most spiritualist meetings during this period adopted similar platforms. The Providence Convention combined virtually every radical plank into a single resolution, endorsing the equal enlightenment, enlargement, and consequent ultimate liberty of all human beings, and the abrogation of all oppression, civil inequality, domestic tyranny, or mental or spiritual despotism, because freedom is the birthright of all and the instinctive demand of every growing spirit. Abby Kelly Foster, the abolitionist and feminist agitator, rejoiced to see that the tendency of spiritualism was to elevate woman. The Rutland Free Convention of 1858, remembered by reformers as one of the great radical events of the period, illustrated both the central position of spiritualists within the radical audience and their role in keeping women's rights central to the radical agenda. I am just returned from attending one of the largest and most important reformatory conventions ever held in this or any other country, wrote the non-spiritualist women's rights advocate and anti-slavery militant Parker Pillsbury on his return from Rutland. The most numerous class in the audience, he reported, was the spiritualists. The Vermonters who called the Rutland Convention did not mention spiritualism, yet the 160 signatures to the call included the state's leading spiritualist and its favorite trance speakers, Achsa Sprague, Sarah Horton, Newman Weeks, and Melvina Townsend. The call was published in The Liberator as well as in the Spiritualist Press. The meeting was called to order by a prominent spiritualist, John Landon, and presided over by another, Jason F. Walker, also known for his abolitionist activities. Radical religion and radical politics attracted the same people. And that's going to be it for now because I'm about halfway through and It's tiresome reading all the way through. All right, that's all, bros.